Watergate is a collective web of political scandals that occurred between 1972 and 1974. It began on May 28, 1972, when a burglary unit broke into the Democratic headquarters. The burglars planted bugs in telephones and photographed documents. The material obtained was filed at the re-election offices under the codename Gemstone. On June 17, 1972, a group of burglars dressed in business suits and rubber gloves broke into the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate offices at Washington, D.C. The plan was to sabotage the Democrats, and the 5 men were arrested at 2:30 a.m. The burglars caught in the act were James McCord Jr., Bernardo Baker, Frank Sturgis, Eugenio R. Martinez, and Virgilio R. Gonzalez. A shakedown disclosed about $6,000 that were distributed amongst the men. They discovered that McCord, a former Central Intelligence Agency and electron expert, was security chief for Nixon's campaign and for the committee to re-elect the president. Further investigation brought the arrest of 2 men who had been involved in the secret investigation unit at the White House, also known as the Plumbers. Those men were G. Gordon Liddy, counsel to the re-election committee of the executive branch, and E. Edward Hunt Jr. Liddy had been, amongst other things, and had been the agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Hunt was a former CIA agent. The 2 were accused of masterminding the whole burglary. A crucial meeting was held on March 30th, 1972. Liddy's associates Hunt went to Florida and recruited the whole burglary team. Re-election committee funds has financed the whole spy quad. Some of the money, including $25,000, contributed by a Minnesota man named Kenneth Dahlberg. On June 18th, Mitchell issued a statement denying any involvement of the re-election committee in the Watergate break-in. The White House disclaimed any knowledge of what Secretary Ronald L. Ziegler called a third-rate burglary. However, President Nixon on June 19th said that he issued his White House Dean Counsel to launch an investigation on the Watergate break-in. Dean later testified that he thought the Watergate was being trailed all the way to the White House. On June 22nd, President Richard Nixon said that the White House is no way involved in the Watergate break-in. It has now been disclosed through the President's statement given on August 5th, 1974, that on June 23rd, 6 days after the Watergate break-in, Nixon learned from the White House Chiefs of Staff that the FBI traced money from the burglars all the way to the re-election committee. On August 29th, the President told in a news conference that the White House was completely clear from any allegations about the Watergate. On September 15th, the 7 Watergate conspirators were indicted in front of a federal grand jury. On that same day, in the Oval Office, the Watergate case was discussed. A White House transcript of the tape recorded a conversation between the Dean and President Richard Nixon. On November 7th, Richard Nixon won presidency. Richard's re-election has been one of the greatest landslides in history. The trial of the 7 conspirators began on January 10th. On January 11th, Hunt pleaded guilty to all charges of wiretapping, burglary, and conspiracy. 4 days later, Barker, Sturgis, Gonzalez, and Martinez all pleaded guilty to the same charges. On January 30th, Liddy and McCord were also convicted. On August 9, 1974, Nixon resigned his presidency and General Ford became the 30th President of the United States. Richard Milhouse Nixon was born on January 9, 1913 in Yorba Linda, California. He was the second of 5 children born to Frank Nixon and Hannah Milhouse Nixon. Nixon graduated second in his high school class. Instead of going to Harvard, which he was offered a full scholarship to, he attended Whittier College, where he became a formidable debater and a college drama student. Upon graduation from Whittier, he received a full scholarship to Duke University of Law. After graduating from Duke University, Nixon moved back to Whittier, where he practiced law at Crouppen Berkeley. He soon met Thelma Catherine, who was his wife. The couple married in 1940 and went on to have 2 daughters. A career as a small-time lawyer was not enough for a man with Nixon's ambition, so in August of 1942, he and Thelma moved to Washington, D.C., where he took a job in Franklin Roosevelt's Office of Price Administration. Soon after, Nixon left that job and joined the U.S. Navy. Eventually, he rose to the rank of lieutenant commander before resigning his commission in January of 1946. In November, Nixon won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. From 1948 to 1950, Nixon was a member of the House UN American Activities Committee. The Republican Convention in 1952, Nixon won the nomination as vice president. In 1960, Nixon decided to run for president of the United States, and he lost to John F. Kennedy. Nixon ran again in 1968 and won by nearly 500,000 votes. He was sworn as the 37th President of the United States on January 20th, 1969. After finishing Nixon's first term, he decided to run for president during January 1973, and he won by a landslide election. The significance to Nixon's life was that he was the first president to ever become impeached. Nixon also brought a disgrace to his presidency as he lied in his involvement in Watergate and abused his power as president.
Richard Milhouse Nixon, the 37th President of the United States, was born on January 9, 1913. His parents owned a small grocery store in Whittier, California.
The only reason we were able to make it go was because my mother and dad had 5 boys, and we all worked in the store.
He excelled academically and graduated from Duke Law School, then returned to Whittier, California to practice law. He also joined a local drama club.
And there he met another aspiring actor or actress, Thelma Ryan, nicknamed Pat.
They married, and in 1942, Nixon joined the U.S. Navy.
They had 2 daughters, Tricia and Julie.
After the war, Nixon ran for Congress.
He ran against a Democratic congressman named Jerry Voorhees, and he said that Voorhees was a communist sympathizer. He worked, and Nixon was elected.
Nixon was on the House Un-American Activities Committee, which looked into State Department officer Alger Hiss's alleged ties to communism.
Nixon shepherded an investigation that led to Hiss's conviction on perjury charges, and he became a household name almost overnight.
In 1950, Nixon ran for the U.S. Senate and won. 2 years later, General Dwight Eisenhower picked Nixon as his vice presidential running mate.
It was discovered that Nixon had a slush fund of sorts.
Eisenhower was prepared to dump him from the ticket.
Nixon acknowledged the fund, but said it was only used to pay for political expenses he felt shouldn't be billed to taxpayers. But he admitted accepting one personal gift.
It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Check. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it.
Eisenhower campaigning, got off the airplane, threw his arm around Nixon and said, "You're my boy."
Eisenhower and Nixon won the 1952 election, and in 1956 they overwhelmingly won re-election. Then in 1960, Nixon ran for president. His Democratic opponent was John F. Kennedy. They squared off in the first televised presidential debate.
Good evening. JFK looked young and tanned and handsome and vigorous, and Nixon, who had not paid much attention to his makeup, looked kind of sweaty and shifty-eyed, and that was it.
Nixon narrowly lost the election. Then in 1968, he ran again for president.
Nixon understood that the central issue facing the country was the Vietnam War, and he said, "I have a plan that will end this war."
Nixon won the election. In 1969, he began to draw down U.S. troops in Vietnam, while expanding bombing in the north as well as the neighboring country of Cambodia.
He opened relationships and normalized relationships with China. He also created the Environmental Protection Agency.
And then there was Watergate.
In June 1972, there was a break-in at the Watergate offices of the Democratic National Committee. Investigators quickly learned that the burglars had ties to the White House.
I knew all the Watergate burglars. Frank Sturgis would relate to me that E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy would tell them, "Richard Nixon wants you to do this, Richard Nixon wants you to do that." And I just thought it was preposterous until Woodward and Bernstein brought it all out.
The Washington Post reporters learned that the burglars had bugged the Democratic headquarters on orders of Nixon's staffers.
I, Richard Milhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear.
Nixon won re-election in 1972, but the Watergate investigation continued.
In recent months, members of my administration and officials of the Committee for the Re-election of the President, including some of my closest friends and most trusted aides, have been charged with involvement in what has come to be known as the Watergate affair.
In February 1974, impeachment hearings began on Capitol Hill. Nixon denied knowing about the break-in. Congress learned the president had recorded his Oval Office conversations.
That really did him in because all of the suspicions that people had about his involvement in the cover-up cover-up of Watergate came to light in these tapes.
The leaders of the Republican Party on Capitol Hill went down to the White House to tell the President of the United States that he was sure to be impeached in the House.
On August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon gave one final speech from the Oval Office.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
He walks out to that helicopter to take off to go back to California and puts his arms up in the victory sign. A tragic figure at that point, and a tragic time in American politics.
Gerald Ford was sworn in as the 38th president on August 9, 1974. One of his first acts was to pardon Richard Nixon. On April 22, 1994, Richard Nixon died. His public funeral followed 5 days later in his hometown of Yorba Linda, California.
All the living ex-presidents attended. President Clinton was in office then and delivered quite a nice eulogy.
He was honored for his real achievements in opening up China and achieving peace with the Soviet Union and being a fairly effective and activist president.